Capitalism is inevitable. It is the natural order of things, a part of human nature. It is the objective, neutral, non-ideological reflection of how the world works. Or at least, that's what its supposedly pragmatic and unbiased proponents would like you to think. And most people already do. Capitalism is the worst economic system except for all the others. Capitalism isn't perfect, but it's definitely the best economic system ever invented. There is no alternative. We have reached the end of history. That's just how the world works. Every single day, I read dozens of comments along the lines of, "I mostly agree with you, your analysis was spot on," until you started blaming capitalism. Communism has already been tried and it failed. Capitalism is imperfect, but it's the best we have. People seem to mostly agree with the critique of capitalism. They see its flaws and shortcomings. But for many, considering any kind of radical change, any kind of novel alternative, entices fear more than anything else. Despite being flawed and outright cruel in the eyes of many, capitalism is still treated as a comfort zone, as an imperfect protection from the horrors that might await us if we try to change it. To justify their conservatism, the partisans of the established order cannot really call it ideal or wonderful. Instead, they have decided to say that all the rest is horrible. Sure, they say, we may not live in a condition of perfect goodness, but we're lucky we don't live in a condition of evil. Our democracy is not perfect, but it's better than the bloody dictatorships. Capitalism is unjust, but it's not criminal like Stalinism. We let millions of Africans die of AIDS, but we don't make racist declarations like Milosevic. We kill Iraqis with our airplanes, but we don't cut their throats with machetes like they do in Rwanda, etc. As Mark Fisher puts it, lowering our expectations, we are told, is a small price to pay for being protected from terror and totalitarianism. Such fear-mongering is, indeed, a vital component in maintaining the illusion of capitalist omnipresence and necessity. While dismissing all alternatives as ideological and therefore dogmatic, capitalist ideology, the most pervasive and all-encompassing of all, presents itself as non-existent, residing both everywhere and nowhere, as a deity that simply is, as a default state of affairs, interwoven into the very fabric of reality, as something that transcends the individual agency of this singular human being, and is thus inevitable. As Comrade Second Thought eloquently explained this mindset in one of his videos,
capitalism isn't even the best choice between a rock and a hard place. It's not a choice at all. It's natural. Resisting it is as pointless as trying to resist the laws of physics.
Advocating for the maintenance of capitalism is therefore seen as non-ideological, as pragmatic, objective, neutral, and unbiased, whereas any counter-propositions to its malignancies is treated as deeply ideological, unnecessarily and aggressively political, and perhaps utopian, as something arbitrarily and forcefully imposed onto the natural state of things. At this point, we reach the supreme irony of how ideology functions today. It appears precisely as its own opposite, as a radical critique of ideological utopias. The predominant ideology today is not a positive vision of some utopian future, but a cynical resignation, an acceptance of how the world really is, accompanied by a warning that if we want to change it too much, only totalitarian horror can ensue. We thus appear to live in a post-ideological, post-historical world, where all other solutions to human organization have apparently been tried and are presented as so broken and dystopian that they must be avoided at all costs. Therefore, the necessary evil, capitalism, prevails, and is in fact so inevitable that it doesn't even need to be named anymore. In fact, you will rarely hear a politician or neoclassical economist use the word capitalism. There simply are moderate, quasi-left and right policies that already presuppose capitalism as their base. Like carbon monoxide slowly seeping into the airwaves of our social organism completely undetected, the hegemony of capital has become so pervasive and all-encompassing that it gives off the impression like it doesn't even exist as a distinct socioeconomic system and mode of production that has come into existence only in the past few hundred years. it seems like that's just how the world has always worked. So by lethargically looking at history and all of our failed attempts to find a sustainable alternative, it turns out to be easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Well, as Charles Baudelaire famously proclaimed, the biggest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. Valiantly and wholeheartedly defending the hegemony of the established world order against the dark specter of communism, of the potentiality of something new, is somehow seen as courageous and virtuous, while opposing it is seen as treacherous, dangerous, and dystopian. Thus, the reverse psychology of capitalist realism is more sinister than any dystopia Orwell or Huxley ever could have imagined. War is peace, freedom is slavery, and as Zizek is often cited saying, ideology today is unfreedom, which you sincerely personally experience as freedom. Nonetheless, the ways in which capitalism establishes its status as the omnipresent, objective truth primarily include tampering with our perception of history. As Mark Fisher puts it, the power of capitalist realism derives in part from the way that capitalism subsumes and consumes all of previous history. Deleuze and Guattari described capitalism as a kind of dark potentiality which haunted all previous social systems. Capital, they argue, is the untamable thing, the abomination which primitive and feudal societies warded off in advance. In its conquest of appropriating all of human history, the most popular argument is that humans have supposedly always been greedy, competitive, and profit-seeking, just like our beloved capitalist. This very argument, besides being palpably wrong in every way possible, as already explained in a video of my own, but also by Hakim and Second Thought on their channels, is a perfect example of capitalist realism and its business ontology. We are being convinced by all its agents and pundits alike that engaging in ruthless competition at the expense of others, kicking the ladder and greedily enjoying the spoils is simply a natural state of being, reflected throughout our own history, but also in the animal kingdom. Ignoring the fact that this is merely how less than 1% of people have the privilege to successfully operate, this kind of philosophy is implanted into the rest of us as the meritocratic potentiality of social mobility, and thus becoming the bourgeois, only if you work hard enough. There is a conscious attempt to justify present economic hierarchies, but also to present everything as monetizable, commodifiable, and sellable in some way, as if everything can and should be run as a business. And business is, let's not forget, at its very essence the ultimate expression of a dictatorial hierarchy. Now, with a quick glance at the actual development of human society, we soon discover that human history is riddled with various modes of production and economic systems that perpetually outgrew one another, with each epoch carrying the seeds of its own dissolution. We will also see that the capitalist mentality of unquestionable monetization and commodification of everything in existence, fueled by greed and self-interest, presents in fact a very minuscule part of the human experience. Mutual aid and cooperation have been an equally decisive factor in these developments, despite this cynical outlook on the human condition. Humans have helped each other, collaborated, and complemented each other's wisdom and abilities to create marvels of ingenuity, as much as they have spent their intellect and energy in finding ways of conquering, genociding, and exploiting each other. As Peter Kropotkin said, sociability is as much a law of nature as mutual struggle. For example, one of the earliest phases in human socioeconomic organization, often called primitive communism, did not have any social classes, country borders, or even money. The development from this state of affairs to class society, which manifested through slavery, feudalism, and capitalism, is a well-documented historical fact, explored in great detail in Engels' monumental work, Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. So, just because greed is one part of human nature and has been present throughout history, does not justify maintaining a system that rewards it. Capitalism is not a full reflection of who we are and have been as humans, but merely a system that rewards and emphasizes our worst sides. To look at people in capitalist society and conclude that human nature is egoism is like looking at people in a factory where pollution is destroying their lungs and saying that it is human nature to cough. As we will ultimately conclude what has already been an established scientific and philosophical truth for over 2 centuries, the only constant in life is change. And those who insist that capitalism is natural and unchangeable will be as silly as when we look back at those who defended the hegemony of kings and monarchs on the basis of divine right. Alright, so why is it then that we always hear the same arguments and surface-level catchphrases being fired as rhetorical ammunition ad nauseum? Why do we still have people who get neurotic and emotional in their sacred duty to defend capitalism, even when they're being exploited themselves? Why are you yourself, dear viewer, still perhaps skeptical of any alternatives and prefer to cling on to the status quo just in case? Let's take a look at a few possible reasons. Well, the first category of people would be those who base their worldview on a deep misunderstanding of what capitalism is. How many times have you heard or said how it's not capitalism, it's globalism, corporatism, the Jews, corruption, bad mentality and mindset, crony, predatory capitalism, etc.? How many times have you heard someone defend capitalism on the premise that this current abomination is in fact not the true, pure reflection of capitalist philosophy, completely ignoring the historical context? Those who argue how this is not real capitalism ignore the fact that socioeconomic systems, including capitalism, go through various different phases according to the dialectical development of societal contradictions. For example, the level of development of the productive forces, the degree and severity of class struggle, advancement in information technology, the degree of centralization of capital, etc. This ignorance about the very fluid logic of the development of socioeconomic systems is led by the presumption that corruption, lobbyism, and similar ills are just bugs in the otherwise benevolent system that can be fixed, perhaps by reverting to a historical stage where none of this existed. A purely idealistic and metaphysical fantasy of some pure version of capitalism that supposedly existed at its very beginnings, until it got corrupted by corporations and big government. In essence, what they're suggesting is to revert things back to how they apparently were at the outset, to strip their current hegemons of their power, thus leveling the playing field, and then eventually themselves become the new hegemons of an apparently more just order that would, due to its inherent tendencies and logic, almost inevitably develop into something like what we have today, because the winners of initial market competition will always do everything to sabotage their competitors and install systems that maintain their hegemony. So, they're basically crying from under the ladder that was kicked into their noses and begging to restart the game because it was unfair. This is of course absurd, because capitalism, as every other mode of production, has different levels of maturity according to the severity of societal contradictions and degrees of class struggle. And all these aberrations they call crony capitalism, corporatism, or globalism are merely vaguely defined stages in this historical development. Historically, capitalism has always found clever ways to conform itself to popular pressure, to subsume and appropriate the struggle against itself, and seek reforms and afford concessions that may guarantee its undisturbed reproduction. Suggesting that we should, or possibly can, ever revert the global behemoth back to a stage where things were arranged in a certain way that would accommodate their wishes and interests is insane. Political economy is not a game of grand strategy where you can arbitrarily impose certain characteristics onto a system and swap them like custom appendages according to popular vote or technocratic mandate. The forces of production and societal relations have their own dialectic of development, which is fought in the arena of class struggle, not in the minds or deeds of individuals or interest groups. So, no, it's not corporatism or globalism we live in, but capitalism at a certain stage of development, a very advanced stage in fact. And no, corruption, lobbyism, and environmental destruction are not bugs of the system upheld by a clique of globalist conspirators aiming to suffocate real capitalism, therefore mere mistakes that can be avoided or ameliorated, but inherent features without which the system cannot function. Now, the second broad category, albeit a more straightforward one, would be those who are simply scared or indoctrinated by relentless anti-communist propaganda. The very fear-mongering described at the beginning serves a very self-evident purpose and is being deployed on mass scale, even after the Cold War, with the remnants of the Red Scare and McCarthyism marauding in our mainstream and alternative media alike, with infinitely wise right-wing pundits spouting the same talking points and catchphrases that have been refuted by Marxists and practical experience for over 2 centuries, to the point where they've become laughable memes. Just keep in mind that every opinion piece that uncritically regurgitates the same anti-communist, anti-feminist, or anti-environmentalist talking points are, more often than not, funded and financed by capital interests whose primary goal is to keep things as they are. You, as a potential advocate of their system, are just an expendable appendage in their crusade. An appendage terrified by their dystopian warnings and beginning to slowly identify with your captors and defend their right to exploit you, in a collective display of the Stockholm Syndrome that keeps you politically sterile and paralyzed. Then we have the personal responsibility gang, those who live out their arrogance and survivor bias to the fullest. This type of apologist will predictably accuse progressives of rejecting personal accountability and responsibility, for blaming others and blaming some abstract thing called capitalism for their own problems and suffering. You know, the whole Jordan Peterson clean up your room first, life is suffering kind of bullshit. As we have seen, such people are perfectly fine with pointing out individual, isolated problems that are simply impossible to ignore, while simultaneously gaslighting you into not criticizing the totality of the very system itself that hosts those symptoms. Imagine you slip and fall every single day onto the same slippery floor at your workplace, with all your pleas to your bosses to fix the safety hazard falling on deaf ears. And now you have this unbearable back pain that's making your life miserable. Now, imagine you come to your doctor and they simply inject you with a local painkiller, with the only comment being that you should stop blaming slippery floors, or your boss who is ignoring the safety hazard, or outside factors, and should in fact look at yourself and take personal responsibility for what's happening. And this is precisely what apologists of capitalism are suggesting. Stop blaming the slippery floor or your boss who is refusing to fix it, take a temporary local painkiller for your pain, and pull yourself up by your bootstraps. In short, stop blaming capitalism, implement a band-aid solution to hide the suffering, and do the bootstrap thing. Don't worry about the system, that's just how the world works, and it's your fault if it works against you. Oh, and your suffering is normal, so just get used to it. Nonetheless, the next broad category is, in a way, an extension of the personal responsibility gang, who equally fetishize personal success stories as examples of how the system can be used to your advantage. You know, the good old from rags to riches American dream sort of thing. A fairy tale that has been exposed as utterly ridiculous in the light of increasingly monopolistic, predatory, and ruthless behavior of the lucky pioneers of competitive capitalism who have now become the sentinels of monopoly capitalism. These petty individuals take the possibility of one day becoming a millionaire and member of the haute bourgeoisie with their brilliant entrepreneurship and financial gymnastics around the system itself, and sell it as a noble lifestyle that everyone can follow, ignoring the fact that only a select few can end up in the elite club. They see their chances of social mobility as almost guaranteed due to their street smarts of generating passive income, investing in crypto and stocks, waking up at 3 in the morning to do dropshipping and work on 3 other side hustles. And they do their best to convince you that it's your fault if you let them rule over you, instead of becoming one of the rulers yourself. Many of the petite bourgeois, that is, small business owners, managerial professionals, miniature stockholders, and financial gamblers, in actuality share more material interests with the working class that they despise so incredibly much than with the big bourgeoisie that they aspire to join. The bourgeoisie proper directs enormous efforts into anti-competitive, monopolistic, and predatory machinations to maintain their position at the top of the pyramid. The ruling class is a very, very premium club, and the pathetic wet dreams of the metropolitan petite bourgeois will not change their self-interested practices of utterly anti-meritocratic, nepotist, and dynastical rule. So, in a nutshell, such people admit that the system, or the matrix, is unfair and rigged. But instead of advocating for its abolition, they opt to take advantage of it and become members of the ruling class. Their philosophy is eat or be eaten. Why fight them when you can join them? Why show solidarity with your fellow working class when you are just a temporarily embarrassed billionaire? Another closely aligned category of people would be the so-called labor aristocracy. Essentially, a very privileged subsection of the working class which, despite working for a wage, nonetheless enjoys great social security benefits compared to their counterparts of the third world. This segment of the working class lives in traditionally imperialist countries of the global north or the OECD, countries that are known for their social democracies and directly reap the benefits of the colonial, neo-colonial, and imperialist super-exploitation of third world labor and agriculture and their cheap, blood-soaked commodities. They're essentially bribed into compliance by their ruling class. They're given a relatively comfortable life with some upward mobility and social security, comparatively solid labor protection laws and union representation, even though they are employed in arguably unproductive sectors of the economy. From the perspective of societal use values, unproductive professions would be, for example, management, marketing, and finance, whereas from the perspective of capital accumulation, unproductive professions would, according to certain Marxist interpretations, include basically everything that is not involved in industrial production, agriculture, and transportation, which would, more concretely, include labor employed in the entertainment, commercial, and service sectors. So, depending on your definitions, the labor aristocracy may include a small privileged section of the workers in the global north, or almost its entire working class. But this is a discussion for another time. The crux of the matter is that these workers are, for the most part, perfectly compliant with the imperialist system of exploitation and destruction of the rest of the world, while their class antagonisms are kept cool and class struggle is bastardized into a mere negotiation about wages and paid vacation. For the comparably prosperous and comfortable existence of a large section of the global north working class, which has never experienced the other side of capitalism, radical change and international communism come off as threats to this very delicate arrangement between them and their domestic bourgeois. The numerous concessions and benefits accorded for the sake of class peace turn this section of the population into compliant advocates of the existing system, and the maintenance of neocolonial and imperialist exploitation based on national chauvinist and racist mythology, which serves to rationalize and justify this inhuman degradation of the rest of the world and their parasitic relationship towards it. Radical change seems to be only initiated and requested from those who have it truly urgent and burning under their feet, those being the victims of imperialism, fascism, and neocolonialism, and those who cannot comfortably wait for a steady parliamentary reform or online petition that is supposed to humanize capitalism or resolve a cultural issue. In a nutshell, workers of the First World are being held hostage and given concessions to keep quiet to the point where they start liking it and, in turn, defend their captors. So, those are basically the broad categories of people who end up defending capitalism, despite getting fucked by it day in and day out, to varying degrees. We've managed to get a grasp of their overall motivations and the conditions that bring them into existence. Now, let's consider a few standard accusations that they like to spout when confronted with criticism of their beloved system. What you will often hear are accusations about jealousy and resentment towards the bourgeois that supposedly tempts the communists to call for his overthrow. You will hear how communists are lazy and want to live off of someone else's work. How those who point out the murderous violence of capitalist institutions have a quote-unquote victim mentality and blame outside factors for their own misery while indulging in self-pity. How those who think there is a better system beyond capitalism are childishly naive and utopian. How socialism has been tried and it never worked. The list only keeps going. Since these accusations have been debunked an infinite amount of times through literature, writings, and videos, instead of wasting my time on this, I'll make sure to link you to a bunch of sources, so feel free to take a look. Now, Before we end this video with a viable solution which goes beyond this self-patronizing and defeatist attitude, let's consider the quasi-solution that such individuals might propose. The most common objection to radical change is the fear of violent upheavals and revolutions, a fear instilled into the mind of the comfortable worker aristocrat who does not want his peaceful existence to get endangered by adventuristic revolutions. There are peaceful ways, he claims, to improve society. Let us be civil and respectful to each other. Let's reach an agreement, strive for reform and compromise, hear out the other side, vote in elections, and so on. He settles for the spoonful of socialism that supposedly makes capitalism work, and accepts social democracy as a quote-unquote compromise between the two systems. Content with breadcrumbs and very temporary and reversible concessions, he remains ignorant to the fact that the maintenance of his beloved social democracy relies on the continued imperialist and neocolonial exploitation and robbery of the Third World, on female and child labor in sweatshops and plantations, on the enslavement and degradation of literally billions of people for his illusion of success and prosperity. In the wake of the ruthless demolition of labor unions and crackdowns on maternal and workers' rights even in their own country, such enlightened centrists end up settling for naive reform, hopeful amelioration and humanization of capitalism through greenwashing and rainbow washing, the repackaging and softening of class oppression, and acceptance of temporary concessions. Unsurprisingly, all of these delusions have been thoroughly debunked by the likes of Rosa Luxembourg more than 100 years ago in her monumental work, Reform or Revolution, and dozens of similar works ever since. So, to conclude this discussion once and for all, here's a Parenti quote for you. The very concept of revolutionary violence is somewhat falsely cast, since most of the violence comes from those who attempt to prevent reform, not from those struggling to reform. By focusing on the violent rebellions of the downtrodden, we overlook the much greater repressive force and violence utilized by the ruling oligarchy to maintain the status quo, including armed attacks against peaceful demonstrations, mass arrests, torture, destruction of opposition organizations, suppression of dissident publications, death squad assassinations, the extermination of whole villages, and the like. Most revolutions begin peaceably. Why would it be otherwise? Who would not prefer to assemble and demonstrate, rather than engage in mortal combat against pitiless forces that enjoy every advantage in mobility and firepower? Peaceful protest and reform are exactly what the people are denied by the ruling oligarchy. The dissidents who continue to fight back, who try to defend themselves from the oligarchs' repressive fury, are then called violent revolutionaries and terrorists. Alright, you say. I might be tempted to give this post-capitalist alternative the benefit of the doubt. But what about all of those failed attempts at establishing communism during the Cold War? Hasn't that shown us the inability of good intentions to transcend human nature? Hasn't it proven us that seeking change is futile and that radicalist adventurism can only result in tragedy and totalitarian tyranny similar to that of Nazism? Well, lucky for you, I've made quite an extensive video on this very topic, tackling all kinds of popular catchphrases, accusations, and dishonest comparisons regarding past socialist experiences. I've also made a video covering the proper attitude towards the mistakes and achievements of those very historical experiences. Beyond that, there's a huge amount of videos by other comrades who've tackled and thoroughly refuted the claim that socialism never worked from various angles, but also objectively criticized the failures of that era, so I'll make sure to link all of those in the description. Regarding the burden of the past on the backs of new generations in their revolutionary prospects, Karl Marx had the following to say: "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living." So, the simple conclusion that can be drawn from viewing former socialism dialectically and materialistically is that, despite failing to reproduce itself under the scrutiny of imperialist pressure, embargoes, invasions, coups and sabotage, and its own inner contradictions, Former socialism has nonetheless improved the lives of hundreds of millions of people who previously lived precarious, exploited, impoverished, and wretched lives under colonial and imperialist oppression. It has launched half of humanity over a century into the future only in the matter of a few decades, and has, despite all of its mistakes and deficiencies, played an unfathomably progressive and positive role in human history. The violent and illegally orchestrated death of the Soviet Union should not be a discouragement and cause for pessimism, nor is it proof of the futility of our cause. The revolutionary idea is far from dead, as the rich historical heritage and experience, supplemented by new technologies and ever-evolving conditions, transmits to us new prospects and tools for radical change. Keep in mind that even the worst instances of socialism nonetheless gave better results for the majority of the population than capitalism ever could. Now, you may wonder how any of these historical experiences that we keep celebrating and criticizing can possibly translate into concrete guidelines or blueprints for future upheavals. How can we convince people about the validity of our cause of transcending capitalist realism if the left has no concrete plan of action, no concrete policy, if we are divided and plagued by sectarianism and infighting? Well, first of all, it's important to note that the material conditions have changed drastically since the 1920s. Capitalism has transformed into something unrecognizable, thanks to the incredible development of the productive forces, automation, the globalization of the world market, novel technologies like the internet, cloud and quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and so on. The answers to the question of the construction of a viable post-capitalist economy and effective economic planning lie precisely in these incredible feats of human ingenuity and our collective ability to use their potential for the benefit of all. Uncontroversially, these tools ought to be leveraged and implemented for the well-being of all of humanity, not for the profit-seeking interests of a self-serving minority. But, as we all know, these technologies are, together with the means of production, currently owned by and employed for corporate interests of the ruling class. The Musks, Bezoses, and dozens of invisible billionaire shareholders of the world, whose only goal is maximizing profits, regardless of the societal and environmental cost, robbing you of the surplus value you create and treating you like an expendable commodity. Moreover, the development of automation and AI, for example, incites valid fear and distrust precisely because we cannot hold them accountable for their inevitable misuse. Their grip on the future of the economy and technology seems unbreakable. They keep promising that the simple advancement of technology and their cynical trickle-down philanthropy will prevent the looming climate catastrophe, alleviate poverty, and solve all of our problems. Experience has shown that these promises and reassurances are merely PR stunts and attempts at whitewashing capitalist history and greenwashing its future. They are methods for maintaining the illusion of capitalist realism. Yet, despite all of this, the agents of capitalism are unknowingly setting up the foundations for socialism, with the implementation of these new technologies within their own capitalist enterprises. A bizarre but very real phenomenon explored in the book The People's Republic of Walmart. With the unstoppable growth of corporate monopolies, capitalists have been increasingly implementing novel organizational technologies to optimize their businesses. A side effect of this is the creation of, in essence, enormous planned economies, coordinated and fueled by sophisticated planning techniques for production and distribution, which transcend neoclassical dogmas of the invisible hand of the market, and are effectively setting the foundations of a future globally planned economy. In the wake of rampant monopolization of key industries and the parallel development of dependent, globalized chains of commodity production, the capitalist market has become essentially obsolete, as all decisions regarding prices, production, allocation, and distribution are done by monopolies and cartels with centrally planned predictive algorithms. It would suffice to say that if Walmart, the world's largest corporation by revenue, was its own country, it would be the 25th largest economy of the world in terms of GDP. And we have many such corporations with equally impressive planned internal economies. In short, capitalism is planting the seeds of its own destruction and laying down the sophisticated infrastructure of the Amazons, Walmarts, and Metas of the world, infrastructure and ecosystems that only need to be democratized and reorganized for the benefit of the working class, and not a handful of greedy shareholders and investors. The seizure of these very sophisticated means of production and distribution, and their democratization for the benefit of everyone, is the working class's central task, as the capitalists have already done half of the job for us. So, to achieve this, what we need is the next step in the evolution of human socioeconomic organization, the true democratization of the workplace and the broader economy. This, however, necessitates the overcoming of private property, the profit motive, and wage labor, and therefore all the symptoms that arise from them, including economic, racial, and sexual inequalities, imperialism, neocolonialism and exploitation, imperialist wars and conflicts, recessions and business cycles, fascism and chauvinism, alienation from ourselves and our surroundings, and the catastrophic implications of the now inevitable climate catastrophe. The methods and tools for achieving this next step in human evolution are already present. Their organizational foundations and principles set by preceding generations, and the brave men and women who valiantly fought and defeated the ruthless force of fascism, and pioneered with their attempts of transcending capitalism, of establishing a socialist economy. Their sacrifices and achievements should not die in vain, and all we need to do to continue their legacy is to update, perfect, and polish their methods, separate the wheat from the chaff, and apply them to our current material circumstances, while leveraging modern technological advancements. There are numerous scientific works being made at this very moment, exploring all of the possible ways in which a post-capitalist economy may function, the technologies, systems, and algorithms that could help us in this endeavor of democratizing and perfecting what previous generations and our own class enemies have already laid down. I'll make sure to leave a comprehensive reading list down below, but a few worthy mentions would be Towards a New Socialism, together with the rest of Paul Cockshott's work, then People's Republic of Walmart, Fully Automated Luxury Communism, and the work of Thomas Serdin. In truth, nobody knows exactly how a socialist, let alone communist society will look like. The actions needed to make the first step have already been demonstrated by comrades from the recent past. Nonetheless, imagining a potential future is a very hard task, with our judgment and creativity obviously clouded by the fog of capitalist realism. Claiming otherwise would be idealist, utopian, and deceptive. But what we do know for sure is that capitalism, despite all of its attempts to convince us otherwise, is an outdated system. It is preventing humanity from unlocking its true creative and productive potential, while stifling innovation and progress and destroying our planet in the process. In the midst of the dogmatism and pervasiveness of capitalist realism, the future may look nihilistic and hopeless. Yet, despite the completely warranted pessimism of the intellect, uncompromising education, agitation, and organization, with a dose of optimism of the will, is all we really need to overcome our current predicament.